Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Don Wolfensberger. I run the Congress programs here at the center, and I'm standing in for Christian Osterman, who is out of town this week. As you know, this is part of our the History and Public Policy Center's series, and this is co-sponsored by the National History Center, an initiative of the American Historical Association, represented here today, as always, by our co-chair, William Roger Lewis. We'd like to acknowledge also the support of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations for helping out with the weekly seminar. Also like to thank Marion Barber, who is with the National History Center, Allison Lilakoff of the Wilson Center for helping to organize today's event as well as all the others, and we are also grateful for the assistance of Hannah Monroe Morris. So thank you. Today, as you know, the topic is the Lumumba assassination and CIA accountability, and we're pleased to have with us Dr. Stephan Weissman. He started out as a professor of political science at the University of Texas at Dallas. He's taught at Fordham University and the Université Libre de Congo, and he came to Washington in 1979 with the staff of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he was with the subcommittee on Africa. And many of you may know that Howard Wolpe, who passed away recently, was the chair of that subcommittee. And so he is a friend of Howard's and a friend of the Center's as a result of all that. But he worked in the Congress from 1979 to 1991. He has since been involved in a variety of things, working with the Agency for International Development, where he worked on their democracy and governance in Africa project. He's also been doing some work on campaign financing, so he's got many and varied interests. But I think for the purpose of today's event, you should know that he is author of two very prominent books. One, American Foreign Policy in the Congo, 1960 to 1964. I believe that was published in 1974, if I'm not mistaken. And more recently, and I do like this title because I think there is a lot in that, and that is A Culture of Deference, Congress's Failure of Leadership in Foreign Policy, and that was published in 1996. Dr. Weissman is a graduate of Cornell and earned his master's and PhD at the University of Chicago. Before we go further, I want to turn things over to our co-chair, Roger Lewis, for any comments that he would like to make.
Just to say that I'm very glad that we were able to persuade Steve Weissman to speak on the Congo. Congo is one of those subjects that keeps recurring in historical debate, historical assessment. The records continue to unfold. It's a matter of interest from the European point of view, specifically, of course, from the Belgian point of view, as well as Africa and the Congo. And especially for the today's topic, the assessment of the CIA. We do have a ritual in which we ask everyone to introduce himself, herself, and Marion Barber would also like to explain why we are asking people to make sure that we have your email addresses.
Director of the National History Center, and we are passing around a list for you to sign in on to make sure that we have your email address if you're not somebody that we normally communicate with, or if you are somebody we normally communicate with. We have about 60 to 90 names that bounce back on a regular basis. So we'd like to have everybody's correct email address, even if you are somebody that manages to hear from us in some way or another. So please sign in. Thanks.
I'm Ross Johnson, Senior Scholar at the Wilson Center.
Stephen Shore with the PBGC.
John Prados with the National Security Archive.
Bill Burrow, National Security Archive.
Kenton Clymer, I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center.
I'm Robert Baum, I'm a fellow at the Wilson Center and an African historian.
Michael Neufeld, Smithsonian Institution.
I'm Giwon Kwon, Wilson Center Scholar.
Petro Prish, Romania Scholar at Woodrow Wilson Center. Dane Kennedy, a historian at George Washington University.
Kent Hughes. I run a program here at the Wilson Center on America and the global economy. A little worried about getting email addresses while we talk about CIA accountability.
Good afternoon, Robert Donnelly, Woodrow Wilson Center.
Angela Santesa, Yard Center.
Eric Arneson, historian at George Washington University, fellow here at the Wilson Center.
Christine Kelly, I'm an intern at the National History Center.
Dave Ottaway is senior scholar here at the center.
Robert Brandstetter, an independent.
Doug DeGroat, Executive Intelligence Review.
Bruce Cooklick, University of Pennsylvania.
Hayden Peak, CIA.
Anita Jones, historian.
I'm Marley Clymer. I'm a retired nurse.
Leland Ellis, Department of Homeland Security, Science and Technology.
Fariborz Fatemi, Oxford Chart Group.
I think that's got it. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Got the microphone in the right place. Can you hear me, everybody? A little closer. Okay. How's this? Still not enough, huh? Then I'm not going to be able to see you. All right, how about that? There was a town meeting in the Congo in August of 2009 that was conducted by the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. According to the New York Times account, a student stood up and he asked Mrs. Clinton if he were to become president of the Congo tomorrow, and if he tried to be independent from the West and follow his own ideas, would he be assassinated? And the reporter said, well, this was a thinly veiled reference to the notion that the CIA had a role in the assassination of the first elected head, really, prime minister of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba. The question itself shows how much this issue still resonates in the Congo. Here we have a student who probably was born at least 30 years after these events. And still there is a persisting feeling that the United States did something that was not appropriate, that was wrong in this important African country. And it has persisted among other Congolese scholars who've looked at, for example, the rule of Laurent Kabila, who was head of the Congo, president of the Congo a few years ago, a former follower of Patrice Lumumba, indicated when the UN were trying to get the United Nations in there to control some of the violence that Kabila was bitter and skeptical because of the past of what had happened then. So this has had quite a resonance, and of course, in Africa itself, the United States image, if you speak to former State Department officials, was hurt for many, many years and affected by the image that the United States had been associated with Lumumba's assassination. The death itself, and the death meaning his physical death, and the fact that because of it he could not be a factor in the Congo's politics, had a lot of consequences. It confirmed the course that had been pursued by the Eisenhower administration and was beginning to be pursued by the Kennedy administration of excluding Lumumba's followers because they were considered too far to the left, too militant, too anti-Western. But that led directly to very bloody rebellions in the Congo. No one knows how many people were killed in the Lumumba's rebellions in 1964 to 1967, but some people number it in the hundreds of thousands. Both the direct violence and the repression, and some of the violence by the rebellions themselves, but also in terms of the starvation of people hiding in the forest and that sort of thing. And you had, of course, after the defeat of these rebellions, the defeat of this movement, which had been quite popular in the Congo, the rise of the Mobutu tyranny. And when that fell, a failed state, which we all know has been an international problem since, and one can't hang everything on Lumumba's assassination, but I think it was a step, an important step toward the Congo we have today. The effect on the United Nations was important. When the Congo became independent in 1960, people felt the United Nations is going to be a very important force in the decolonization movement and ironing out problems and in other areas, not just keeping a peace that had been established, but in what you call today peace enforcement. And the United Nations didn't do any of that until the end of the Cold War, after the Congo. The Congo was a test, and in a way, it failed the test, didn't create enough of an international consensus. And one factor in that was what happened to Patrice Lumumba. Now, most Americans, and even many diplomatic historians, are not aware of what I'm going to discuss here, of the fact that there was a CIA role in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Secretary Clinton wasn't completely aware of it either, or she didn't seem to be. When she answered the student, she said, I can't excuse this past and I won't try. Congo and much of Africa, she said, has been dominated by, quote, a history of colonialism and abuse. Kind of hanging it on the Belgian colonialists, maybe. But I think there's something to be learned that people have not been fully aware of. In January of 1961, over 50 years ago, Lumumba, who was a prisoner of CIA-financed Congolese leaders who had replaced him after a coup, he was transferred by them to a Belgian-backed so-called independent province of Katanga, which had most of the wealth of the Congo. He was then tortured and murdered by the Katangese and their white officers, Belgian officers. People up to now haven't focused very much on the CIA role, partly because the Church Committee, a committee of the United States Senate, investigated this and determined, and this is the quote, Lumumba was killed by Congolese rivals. It does not appear from the evidence that the United States was in any way involved with the killing. But this is a mistake. The CIA station chief, Larry Devlin, participated, along with the Belgian officials and Congolese on the CIA payroll, in the decision to transfer Lumumba to this secessionist state of Katanga. There was actually at the time a question of transferring him to one or of the other of two secessionist states, both Belgian-backed. In both states, the leaders had sworn to kill Lumumba. The fellow in Katanga, the interior minister, had said, if Lumumba comes here, we'll do with him what the Belgians didn't want to do. We'll kill him. So he participated in the decision. Not only did he participate in the decision, and here's where the accountability issue comes up. Larry Devlin withheld his knowledge of a plan to transfer Lumumba to one of these two secessionist states from CIA headquarters, from the State Department, until Lumumba was already dead. The telegram indicating he had been warned 3 days in advance of a transfer arrived hours after Lumumba was already dead. Address if these problems are continuing today. What we have in the Congo is a very unusual form of access. The Church Committee investigated several assassination attempts, and as a result of that, it was able to get access at a moment of vulnerability of the CIA, because it's during the Watergate era when all the domestic operations were exposed, to lots of cables and things of that sort. But beyond that, there was a lot of stuff they didn't publish. They had private interviews with people like Larry Devlin. They had various hearings
They weren't quite public hearings, but there were hearings with people where they took testimony. There were cables that were not published in their final report. And these are gradually being declassified under the JFK Assassination Act because it was an assassination. It had something to do with the era of JFK. And so there's been some declassification of these files. I've also had access to one of 5 studies that were done by the Church Committee that remain classified today. These were studies of CIA paramilitary action, including in Laos, Vietnam, Angola, Indonesia, and the Congo. And in that document, there are also numerous details about the CIA actions in the Congo. And finally, of course, there's also a Belgian parliamentary investigation. The Belgians have apologized for their role in the assassination of Lumumba. And they had done a very thorough investigation. And finally, there have been memoirs. Notably, the CIA station chief, Larry Devlin, wrote a memoir. Belgian officials who were involved have also written about this or been interviewed about this. One would have hoped that we would have also had a volume of that Foreign Relations of the United States series that would have talked more about this, since there is a mandate since 1991 for that series to declassify some CIA documents so that we could put together what had happened in the Congo. The volume they did produce, which covers most of this period when Lumumba was being targeted, that volume had almost nothing about CIA operations. And so they, now with the mandate since 1991, they've been working on a volume that would include this, but that volume was essentially complete and reviewed by a historical advisory panel that Roger Lewis has sat on in 2001 and has not appeared yet. 12 years later, almost 11 years later. Might appear next year, we hear. Why hasn't it appeared in 12 years? This examination of really CIA as part of U.S. foreign policy from 1960 to 1968. The main reason, and not the only reason, but the main reason has been the struggle between State Department historians and CIA historians of what can be released, what can you say, with the CIA resisting any identification of who was paid, saying we'll give global figures for the cost of operations but not the amount for various aspects of operations, not wanting to even identify Devlin, who has actually published a memoir that talks all about this. The other thing I want to mention is when you look at Lumumba's assassination and the role of the CIA, it helps you understand some of our problems in the contemporary world with the agency. And I'm talking about a rather narrow problem of accountability. Is the agency doing what the U.S. government said it should do? Covert action today focuses on individuals. Maybe they're members of groups. In the classic day of covert action, CIA operations to influence governments, it focused on supporting an insurgency, supporting a political party, supporting a propaganda operation in order to affect the state. But now, as you read about counterterrorism, for example, a lot of the CIA effort, maybe the predominant part of the CIA effort, is really not focused on changing a government, influencing a government, supporting a government. It's really more like the Lumumba case. It's talking about, may have political ramifications, an individual, targeting an individual. Second of all, these operations today involve just what we had in the Lumumba case, close CIA relations with foreign security types, foreign officials. What happened to Lumumba comes out of that context of the relationship And that's why it's so hard to pinpoint. How much is CIA? How much is Congolese? How much is CIA? How much is Pakistani, ISI, intelligence service, etc.? And then finally, just as I'll show in the Lumumba case, these covert action efforts against individuals have a tension within them. The policy itself has a tension within it. How much are we going to weigh on the side of human rights? How much are we going to weigh on the side of anti-terrorism, for example, when we're seeking to question some alleged or suspected terrorist? How should we treat them? Well, we're supposed to do both. You know, get them, but treat them humanely. But there's a tension there. And as I'll show, there was a prime minister, and Kasavubu, the president, the army mutinied because it had no promotions. The people were still sergeants. There were no officers. They were supposed to be all Belgians. In fact, the Belgian general who commanded them wrote on the blackboard, before independence equals after independence, to tell them that nothing is going to change. And Lumumba, as the head of the government, clashed with the United Nations over issues like the Belgians had come in, they had reoccupied the country, wanted to get them out. They had promoted a secession in Katanga and would later do so in another province, South Kasai and other areas. Wanted to get them out. And Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General, felt Lumumba, and he was right in part, was mercurial, was not consistent, was too impatient, hard to work with. But in the United States, the image that formed was, in the administration, here's a guy, he'd gotten some money during his campaign from maybe the Belgian Communist Party, like for campaign buttons. There wasn't anybody much to support nationalist movements in the Congo and Belgium except the Belgian Communist Party. He had some anti-Western advisors. He was talking very nationalistically. He was very anti-Belgians. And from our perspective, from the U.S. perspective, this man was a threat, because if he couldn't get together with the UN, and he was impatient with the way they were condoning the secession in Katanga and the Belgians' role in it, well, then the UN might be forced out, and the Soviets might help him. And the radical Africans who were kind of a little more pro-Soviet, like in Ghana and Guinea, they might help him. So at the end of the day, the United States opposed Lumumba. Scholars, former officials, all say this, this was very exaggerated. Lumumba was really not going to lead the Congo into communism. The Soviets had no logistic capacity, and Alan Dulles later admitted it in a CBS broadcast, to really do anything much in the Congo. They sent a few transport planes and 100 trucks and a couple of hundred people, while there were like 20,000 Belgians, 20,000 UN guys. There was so much more force and so much more presence and cadres on the other side that it was really an exaggeration. But the U.S. response was covert action. U.S. helped. They planned a whole covert action. They started a project called Project Wizard, which was a political action project in which they recruited people. With the Belgians, they planned to overthrow Lumumba. There was supposed to be a no-confidence vote in the Senate, and Kasavubu was supposed to then dismiss Lumumba. Kasavubu jumped ahead 2 days in advance and dismissed him before the no-confidence vote. And when he couldn't do much with his chosen prime minister, then they had another coup which was backed by the United States, by President Mobutu. He later became President Mobutu. He was Sergeant Mobutu. After the mutiny, he was promoted to Colonel Mobutu and Chief of Staff of the Army, and then he became Colonel Mobutu, effectively the main head of government of the Congo, with a bunch of commissioners that would assist him. And Kasavubu left in place. All right, so now the assassination takes off from there. Eisenhower, at a meeting in August of 1960, says something at the meeting that the person who wrote the notes later testified sounded to him like assassinate Lumumba. Alan Dulles, who was at the meeting, the CIA director, took it as such, began to work on it. Douglas Dillon, who was at the meeting, said he didn't remember that exactly, but it could have been one of the things that could be included in whatever strong expression of concern Eisenhower voiced. And 3 steps were taken toward killing Lumumba. Now remember, Lumumba now, at this stage, he's been displaced, but he has some UN protection, but he's going into the townships, politically rousing up people. Mobutu doesn't have really much of a political following, just controls some military people. So there are 3 things, 3 approaches. First approach was to encourage Congolese to kill Lumumba. First, you sat around and they discussed killing Lumumba, and you didn't say anything negative. And these were Congolese who were often in U.S. pay. And then, to give you the most explicit example of it, on September 20th, CIA Station Chief Devlin sent a cable. He said, well, he'd been warning Mobutu of plots. This is 6 days after the coup, and he was urging Mobutu to either arrest or provide more permanent disposal of Lumumba and 2 of his ministers. I asked John Stein, who was later a colleague of Devlin in the Congo, what does he mean by more permanent disposal? Stein was also eventually the head, I think, of covert services. And he said he means kill him. He says, that's what he meant. It's interesting, the very next day after Devlin sends this cable saying he's urged more permanent disposal, Dulles tells the National Security Council that Lumumba is not yet disposed of and remained a great danger as long as he was not disposed of. Now, he didn't use the word permanent, but when it has an indication there. In fact, 2 of the 3 people that Devlin urged be arrested, 2 colleagues of Lumumba, one of whom later died with Lumumba, were arrested. And they were on the verge of being sent to Katanga, that Belgian-supported secession, when the UN intervened to free them. All right, the second sort of series of steps that was taken were like unilateral assassination actions, where, well, let's figure out, you can't rely on Mobutu, he's hesitating a little bit to do anything more about arresting Lumumba. What can we do? And basically, there were 9 proposals discussed. 8 of them were made by Devlin, 1 of them by his superior, Bronson Tweedy. And the most promising one was get a European advisor to one of Lumumba's colleagues. Lumumba was living in the prime minister's residence then, with some UN protection, to get access to the residence, put some biological poison on his food or toothpaste. That was the most promising idea. There was a problem in it that the guy's wife was a resident alien in the United States, could be traced back. That was a condition. You didn't want it to trace it back unless you had this greatest opportunity in the world. You maybe take the risk. But the problem that idea foundered on the fact that in the end the guy couldn't get access, this European advisor. He couldn't get access to Lumumba. And there were other ideas, ethnic factions people had, or army factions would attack him and kill him and so forth. But they were all dismissed. These guys didn't practice good security. They were unreliable. So then they say, okay, we'll send someone else from headquarters, take care of this. You're pretty busy, Larry Devlin, with all these covert operations you're doing. And they sent a guy down there. And he said, well, I'm not going to kill him. The most I'll do, I don't think it's right. I'll abduct him. And we'll have an abduction scheme, and then Mobutu maybe will probably give him capital punishment or something, but, that's what I'll do. And they actually worked with Mobutu. They got some of Mobutu's troops, disguised themselves as UN guards. And the idea was to penetrate the residents, posing as UN guards and others, and somehow get him out of there, and without anything going wrong. But Lumumba escaped. he left the residence and went to try to get to his home base in Stanleyville, and he was stopped, eventually and captured and brutalized by the Mobutu regime. When he was on his way to Stanleyville, suddenly the covert action went back to assassination. There was a guy, a third country national, as they call it, a European smuggler, who was the guy who was supposed to pierce the guard and get into, capture Lumumba, take him away from the UN. And he said, well, I'll go to Stanleyville. I'll take care of this. I don't need any of these troops with me. I'll do it. And, of course, what could he do? He couldn't abduct Lumumba in Stanleyville. There were hardly any government troops there, no one to work with. He said, I want to do direct action, which is often used as a code name for assassination. So it kind of went back a little bit, but Lumumba was captured, and that was finished. And that from then on, there didn't seem to be much pressure on Larry Devlin to do anything. I mean, Mobutu had captured him. We had Lumumba in his hands. And his hands, the guy who was supervising the abduction later told the church committee in a passage that was eliminated from the final draft of the report that Mobutu was the man we had put our chips on. He was our close instrument. So, well, that doesn't mean Mobutu, as Bruce Kuklik over there always reminds me, was a perfect instrument of the CIA. But nonetheless, he was felt to be enough of an instrument that, well, he's got Lumumba now under his control. But nonetheless, and here's the third approach, Devlin gave the green light for the Congolese and the Belgians to transfer Lumumba to Katanga, where he was murdered. Why do I say this? Well, let's see first what happened. There was concern by many people, with Lumumba being a prisoner, that he was so dynamic that he would persuade his captors, who might have other grievances against the government, like salaries and everything, to liberate him. Or maybe, because the government was kind of having a lot of trouble with Lumumba's followers having set up a base in Stanleyville and getting organized, and looking politically weak, that maybe somehow the UN or even Mobutu maybe would negotiate a little bit with Lumumba, and Lumumba might come back. The Belgians were very upset about any possibility that this could happen. And they began to discuss with the Congolese, where can we put Lumumba where this won't happen? And one of the ideas was to put him in one of these secessionist provinces. So then finally there's a mutiny. The soldiers who are guarding Lumumba actually mutiny. And the whole government rushes down to the base, 80 miles from the capital. And they promise them more money. And they kind of go back, not doing anything. And then the next day, the Congolese decide we're going to transfer Lumumba. And a government leader comes up to Devlin and says to him, we are going to transfer Lumumba. Turned out to one of these two secessionist provinces, where the leader had said, if he ever got hold of Lumumba, he'd be tried and executed. At the last minute, 3 days later, Lumumba instead was sent to the other secessionist province, Katanga, which had been the preference all along of the Belgians and Congolese. The Katangese leader, a guy named Shambe, agreed, and Lumumba was sent there. Now, you could look back at this, and you could say, well, so what? So the CIA, so they heard something, well, it's a courtesy. You know, somebody came over to them and said, look, this is what we're going to do. There's no documentation that there was anything more than that. And just because we don't see what his reaction was, what Devlin's reaction was to that, what he said, what he surmised, what he thought, so what? He probably couldn't have influenced them anyway. I mean, you could take that point of view, and that's a point of view some people have taken. But I think that the details of the context, what was the relationship between Devlin and the people who decided to transfer Lumumba, was ignored by the Church Committee. The Church Committee was focused on a murder and not on the covert action, the surrounding context. And when you look at that, I don't think there's any real reasonable doubt that Devlin was involved strongly with in giving a green light for this. The most important aspects of this were under Project Wizard. You had all these people who were the key Congolese leaders. I won't go into detail about who they were, who were being supported by the CIA through the two coups. They were being funded regularly through the project. In addition, another $250,000 was given to them in October to pay them and to personally support Mobutu, to pay the top Congolese leaders. Contingency military planning was in course in order to support them if there was a clash with Lumumbists. And as the document that I had mentioned, the one that hasn't been declassified yet, said, there was a daily intimate working relationship between the CIA station and these the so-called Congolese moderates. Devlin himself in his memoir writes, and it's credible because this is what people who've reviewed the documents and wrote that study also say, I was working closely with Mobutu and many of the new ministers, providing them with advice and guidance. Well, that explains why he was consulted. That explains why, not only that, it helps explain why his consulting with him meant that he had an important role. Let's take a look at all the other times he was consulted. According to Cable's, Devlin's memoir, etc., every single time the Congolese leaders wanted to do something about Lumumba, they consulted the CIA, and if the CIA didn't like it, they didn't do it. The talk about reconciliation between Lumumba and Kasavubu took off just after Mobutu had his coup. It was a possibility. Mobutu had said he only wanted to neutralize them at first, even though he did a number of other things that were kind of anti-Lumumba, tilting. We advised against it. They didn't do it. There was no reconciliation between Lumumba and Kasavubu. He said, arrest Lumumba. Devlin said, arrest Lumumba. 3 days later, Lumumba was arrested, along with two of his ministers, as I discussed earlier. At one point, the Congolese said, you know, we're going to attack the UN if they don't give us Lumumba. If we want to arrest Lumumba, if they keep protecting him, we're going to attack them and grab Lumumba with our forces. And they were about to do it. And both the ambassador and the CIA chief said, don't do it. And they didn't do it. And the ambassador wrote that was a major factor in why they didn't do it. They discussed who to appoint. Devlin discussed with Mobutu who to appoint as commissioner. Commissioners were like ministers, his main helpers. And we had influence over selection of commissioners. Finally, and this kind of gets closer and closer to the murder, after Lumumba was brutalized in view of television cameras worldwide by Mobutu's troops, in front of Mobutu, there was a huge turmoil at the United Nations. African nations, even some of those who didn't like Lumumba, the most moderate ones, were very upset. And the United States, because of that, was pushed into saying, you have to ensure human rights of Lumumba. To get Kasavubu to say it, that he would, to get the International Red Cross in to examine Lumumba. And it was a big step in terms of, because the African and Asians at the UN had been so upset by some of the things that had happened in getting their support and keeping their support and ensuring that some of the African forces that had threatened to leave the Congo wouldn't leave. So, what really happened? Belgian advisor to Mobutu, Colonel Marlière, wrote or communicated to someone writing his doctoral thesis in Belgium this interview. What is certain is that there was a consensus and that no advisor, whether he be Belgian or American, thought to dissuade them. Devlin's attitude, in an interview I did with him, he said, "I didn't do it. I assumed the locals would take care of it then." He acknowledged to the church committee that in a discussion with Mobutu around this time, he had the impression that Mobutu might have Lumumba executed. Doesn't say any objection. So given all of the past context, the influence the United States had, its relationship with these people, the fact that they listened to the United States frequently, almost all the time with Lumumba, it seems to me that you cannot infer anything more than the fact that he didn't say anything or didn't do anything after being informed of this plan where he knew that Lumumba was likely to be killed, makes him a participant in the decision. Now, interestingly, Devlin would never admit, either in his book or anywhere else, in testimony for the church committee or anywhere, that he knew in advance of the transfer, even though there was a cable on it that he sent. He didn't remember it. He had a great memory for a lot of things, and his book is very interesting. And I think he didn't remember it, or he couldn't remember it, because it would open up all of these questions. Now, he withheld from CIA headquarters and others, State Department, his knowledge. CIA colleagues of his that I spoke with, former colleagues of his, not in the Congo at that time, but later, said it was very unusual for you to have this kind of warning and hold it for 3 days. Normally, you tell the ambassador, he informs the State Department, or you send an intelligence information report, which is shared with some other agencies. And he did eventually send that report, but only after Lumumba was dead. Why did he do that? The consequence, we can say, of withholding the report was to prevent the possibility of the United States intervening because it was politically untimely for, given the problems we're having with the Afro-Asians at the UN, for Lumumba to be murdered in a Belgian-supported province, brutally. I spoke to Frank Carlucci about this. He was in the embassy at the time. He later became the deputy director of the CIA and the deputy secretary of defense. Or was he secretary of defense? And he said if state had been informed, in his opinion, it's reasonable to think they would have sent a word of caution to Mobutu's forces, though I can't say for sure. And that's my position. Can't say for sure. But the accountability issue is right there. They didn't get the chance. And in the interest of time, let me just quickly give you a little bit of the evidence of why State Department might have intervened. Basically, the problems at the UN were such that there were preoccupation of all the people, preoccupation of the administration. The administration not only had to assure humane treatment of Lumumba, had to get the Congolese to assure humane treatment of Lumumba, but the administration also had to put in their resolutions they were supporting that anyone, no action should be taken in the Congo against recognized law and order against anyone under arrest. This was in resolutions. And even with that in the resolutions in the UN in December, the resolutions failed. And not only did they fail in the Security Council and the General Assembly, that's where U.S. policy was in the UN, but not a single African nation voted for them, even the very conservative French West African countries. So they were in a real bind. It was such a bind, and again, I'll just shorten this. It's such a bind that on January 12th, when Eisenhower was briefed on the problems they were having with the UN, and not only with the UN constituency, the people who are members but with Hammarskjöld, who had kind of shifted his position to be a little less anti-Lumumba, Eisenhower said the UN had made a major error in admitting to membership any nation claiming independence. And then he said, ultimately, the UN might have to leave U.S. territory. Now that's how, so the question is, would the State Department or U.S. government want to provoke the kind of diplomatic outcry in response to Lumumba's death that eventually did ensue and was a factor in even the new administration's policy constraining them in February of 1961. And you can see also in the reaction of the State Department to the death of Lumumba. The next day, they called in the Belgian ambassador, Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, and he said, gosh, you know, this is the Belgian report of it. He said, well, he was complaining about a big gaffe about the transfer of Lumumba, how this action seriously contravenes diplomatic action being taken by the U.S. favorable to Belgian interests. And he asked them to use their influence for humane treatment. A similar push was made to the Katangese authorities. Devlin writes, I suspect they believed that they had told me their true plans for Lumumba, this is his Congolese leaders, the United States would demand that he receive humane treatment or even he be released. Well, if they had held this view, then probably he did as well. He was their key advisor. Anyway, they did tell him of their true plans to transfer Lumumba to where he would likely be killed. And as I say, he withheld this, eliminating the tension in U.S. policy between, well, Lumumba is the most effective guy, we can't let him come back. On the other hand, we have these human rights diplomatic commitments. Now, since then, let's fast forward at 40 years. And let's acknowledge that since then we have a number of things that have been, steps that have been taken to help improve CIA accountability. For example, President now can't deny or, that he might have authorized something. He has to have a finding of some covert action. There's a congressional oversight system that's been set up. However, there's a marvelous, very valuable report done by the CIA Inspector General that gives us pause. That was completed in 2008. 2008, just 4 years ago. It dealt with a program, a covert action program directed against individuals in Peru called the Peru Air Bridge Denial Program. And it was actually not technically covert action because part of it had to have been made public, but it was actually conducted as if it were a covert action by the covert action bureaucracy. Well, he found, the Inspector General of he's semi-independent, by the way, the Inspector General of the CIA found they'd shot down 15 planes in this narcotics air bridge denial program between 1995 and 2001. And the reason there was even this investigation was the last plane that was shot down carried a missionary family. And a woman who was a young woman missionary was killed, as was her baby. And her husband, I think, was wounded. And that exposed the program, so they investigated. And what we find is exactly the elements that we see in the Lumumba case. There had been presidentially authorized procedures to combat these narcotics traffickers, but only on condition that certain procedures to protect the innocent life were observed. And these included, I won't describe the whole program, but involved basically American tracking planes and then Peruvian interceptors. And the idea was, look, if we see a plane that we don't know if it should be there, we have to check the tail numbers, we have to see if it has had a flight plan, see if there's any suspicion, radio warnings, visual signals, flap your wings or turn your lights on, try to, intercept them, say they should come down. No action unless there's through the Peruvian chain of command, fire some warning shots, I forgot about that, and give them time to respond. Well, the investigation found none of that was consistently observed. All the procedures were violated most of the time. And yet, the CIA people who were two bureaus, really, the Latin American and the Crime and Narcotics Bureau supervising this, just let it go. They had videotapes even of these things. That's what the Inspector General used. And the reports were said, oh yeah, we observed all procedures and so forth and so on. What happened was that the presidentially mandated procedures were difficult for the Peruvian Air Force to perform. It was preoccupied with pilot safety, avoiding escape of targeted planes. So the procedures were just abandoned from the beginning, from the very beginning. Not even the first shoot down. And with the CIA operators' consent, and they covered it up. So here again, there's a tension. You don't resolve it. There's a tension. Well, maybe we can do something to fix this. Maybe we refer the problem to the policymakers. Look, the Peruvian Air Force needs training, or they can't do this, or we change the procedure. No, none of that. When it was investigated, the CIA did everything to minimize responsibility, to blame the foreigners, language difficulties, and so forth and so on, and so forth. Finally, we get to the fascinating thing at the end of the Peruvian thing is that George Tenet, the head of the CIA, what's his reaction to this? He says, you know, we ought to do an immediate review of agency management and oversight of covert action. No indication. He senses the problem right there. No indication was ever done, and the Inspector General, when he writes his report, recommends in 2008 review command and control for all CIA covert action or others involving lethal authorities to ensure clear chain of command and accountability. We don't have any public evidence, however, of such action. And finally, we come to counterterrorism. This is the main theme of the CIA covert action program today. Leon Panetta said he spent 30% of his time on it. Michael Hayden, his predecessor, used to say, I do CTC, PROR, meaning counterterrorism, non-proliferation, and the rest of the world. 10% of the workforce, according to the Washington Post, is in the counterterrorism center of the CIA. 20% of the analysts are now in a targeting track. They're targeters. The number of CIA counterterrorist operations, according to CIA lawyer John Rizzo, is greater than the number of operations, at least, in the entire Cold War. This is since 9/11. We don't have enough, obviously, information, documentation, memoirs, etc. Inspector General studies provide many important details, but we can still reasonably infer the problem exists. And just the two examples I want to give you in concluding. First, rendition. And they're both very similar in structure to what happened to Lumumba, who could be considered maybe the first rendition. Rendition is usually transfer somebody from your custody, usually, to another country where it may be interrogated, imprisoned, or killed. Well, we've had a rendition program that transfers terrorist subjects to other countries for interrogation or imprisonment. Places like Egypt, Morocco, Syria, Jordan, Libya, Afghanistan. And we have many credible press reports of mistakes, some of them supported by foreign governments whose subjects were involved in these renditions, and torture and other inhumane treatment. An interesting case, I don't have time to go in now, and we could discuss it, is Belhaj. Abdel Belhaj, one of the key military leader in Tripoli, Libya, was himself a victim of rendition by the CIA and the British. And there are documents that they captured in Libya that have been released that talk about this. And he was tortured in Libya before being released finally on an amnesty. President Bush acknowledged we had a rendition program, but he said they had assurances against torture from the various governments involved. And the CIA director said there's more safeguards in rendition now than there were in previous rendition programs before 9/11. But it's not supported by the accounts that we have seen in the press, nor is it by the fact that the Obama administration, when they got in, said, we got to change this. They were convinced, from whatever their sources, that they needed to do more, and that the CIA was not itself alone resolving the tension between human rights, let's say, and diplomatic reverberations, and taking suspected terrorists off the street. Now, I haven't even talked about the mistakes that were made in some of these programs about who was a suspected terrorist. So the Obama task force came in, and they've recommended, we don't know if it's been implemented, look, we need to have the State Department involved in looking at these assurances we're getting that, these people won't be tortured, and we need to have some mechanism maybe for private access to the prisoner. But it's still unclear, the State Department involvement, what is that going to mean? Do they look at it? Do they make the decision, or does the CIA make the decision? And private access mechanism, well, the Canadians had a guy who was captured, and actually the consul got in to see him, but he was too afraid to really talk about what was happening to him. Again, this is something where there is an accountability problem. It's recognized by the government, and it's being looked at in an ad hoc way. Finally, even more than the rendition, the broader program we have, the United States has, is working with hundreds of members of the security services in foreign countries to target, arrest, interrogate, and debrief suspects. Sometimes they sit in on the questioning, as in Somalia and Pakistan. U.S. officials have said tips producing various operations outnumber many times the more public unilateral drone strikes. For example, joint operations reported by the Washington Post, I believe, with the Pakistani Secret Service, there were 100 of them in just 18 months. No detailed discussion we have of any of the standards being used, but it's hard to see the difference between rendition, where you arrest and you transfer perhaps to torture by another country, interrogation and torture, and actions to enable another country to arrest and torture. What's the difference? So, conclusion. Obama has said he doesn't want to look backwards. He didn't want to focus on the past administration abuses. Sometimes he did, though, ad hoc, like in rendition. Clinton also was impatient in the past. In that town meeting, question she said was this to that student: will I be dragged down by the past, or will I decide to do something to have a better future? And the question is, if you don't understand the past, you don't understand the problem the past can illuminate about the resistance of bureaucracies, especially secret ones, to change, about them putting their priorities first, about the need perhaps for reorienting the bureaucracy, for establishing more independent oversight mechanisms that are effective, then you're mortgaging your future. Thanks for your patience.
As part of the historical background, I would like to say just a brief word about the missing CIA volume in the Foreign Relations series. I was on the advisory committee at the time that this was being declassified. Indeed, I was the chairman of the committee and made it my goal to make sure that this volume was published along with the missing volume on Iran. Well, here we are, some 10 years later, and the volumes have not yet been published. But having said that, I do not believe that the missing volume is going to add all that much to the public knowledge that we already know about the circumstances in the Congo. Evidence such as this is both public as well as official, and it requires a very patient and tenacious course of investigation, such as the one we've had this afternoon, before we can all put it together. And I think that this is an admirable job of reconstruction and of pointing us to problems in the future, such as those of rendition.
Yeah, if I might just exercise prerogative of the chair and ask a sort of a context question, and just an aside, a lot of this sounds parallel to what happened to Ngo Dinh Diem in Vietnam just a couple of years after that, the assassination of him. But I'm wondering to what extent the U.S. attitude had to do with their perception, at least, that Lumumba really was more aligned with the communists than he indicated he was, or others say he was. I know he did, I think, ask first of all for U.S. help in putting down the secession in the Katanga, and the Katanga province, and we refused. But then the Soviets did come in with trucks and supplies and arms and so on, which tend to confirm then our suspicions that somehow he was more aligned with the communists than he was with anyone else. But could you? And I guess the other thing that occurred to me, I was in college then, just a freshman, but I remember that the U.S. press seemed to be very much more sympathetic with Moy Shambi and his secessionist movement than they were with Lumumba trying to keep the country together. But did that play in at all in our approach to all this?
I agree with you that that was the perception. It used to be there was an idea of positive neutralism among the newer countries that are decolonized, that they were going to take help from everybody. And Lumumba is probably the first leader that was opposed on the grounds of anti-communism his government had actually asked for 3,000 American troops. Their first instinct was to ask for American troops, and the U.S. chose to work through the UN because they didn't want to have an excuse for Lumumba then to ask for Soviet troops. Nobody believed that the Soviets were going to, provide a huge sort of a military force, or could provide such a huge military force at the time. I think the idea was that it would be perceived, there was a suspicion of Lumumba, and that it would be perceived as the Soviets having, a higher degree of influence in Africa as African nations were decolonizing. But as I say, I think the scholars who've looked at it, who've understood Lumumba, and it was very difficult, I've argued, for conservative Republicans like Douglas Dillon, Christian Herter, Dwight Eisenhower, to understand people like Lumumba in many ways. It was a very long social distance. An angry guy who lived under Belgian colonialism, distrusting the Belgians, being intemperate, asking for the Africans to come in and replace Europeans, because he didn't trust the Europeans. There was a greater degree of understanding, at least under the Kennedy administration. So I think that was an aspect. You're right that a lot of the press, I think, played to this with regard to the sympathy for Katanga. And in part, people in the administration always, Douglas Dillon in particular, it was from Dillon Reed, the big Wall Street banking firm, don't close the door on Katanga. If everything goes bad in the Congo, we can still work with Katanga. And it has the wealth, and it's very conservative government. So I think some of that did play in the press.
Well, the Soviets got a lot of mileage out of it. They established the Patrice Lumumba University, I believe, in Moscow, which brought Africans to be educated in the Soviet Union.
People from non-African countries as well.
Yeah. Well, let's take questions. Wait for the microphone and identify yourself and your affiliation. We'll start over here with Stephen.
Stephen, sure. The reaction of the White House, the Eisenhower White House, isn't that what one would expect, knowing their background with overthrowing Mossadegh and Arbenz in Guatemala, that it would have been a real departure for them not to continue the same methods, even if the result was more violent than was ideal. And Kennedy, even though Chedi Yagan was not murdered, nonetheless, essentially, no sooner did the president finish shaking hands with him than he instructed the CIA it was clear to give him the green light to prevent his coming to power. But on the present implications, is there any real it's a kind of charade of we pretend to oversee the CIA and then we're shocked when these things happen, but this pattern has been going on for decades, and is there any real popular will in this country for effective oversight?
Well, I think there are two separate questions here. One is the perspective of the Eisenhower administration, and obviously they were conservative. Now, the Congo was a little bit of a reach because there was no Communist Party, no disciplined cadres. Most of the studies of Soviet policy in the Congo said they didn't do much, they were tentative, they stood apart. After Lumumba's death, they didn't really give that much help to his successors. I think it's a little different than where you had a case like with Arbenz, where there's a Communist Party in Guatemala and so forth. Mossadegh is still another case where you can make distinctions. But I think that the accountability issue is the one I've tried to stress, and we should really discuss even more. I'd like to hear your views on it. If we have an important role for covert action in American foreign policy, and you can agree or disagree with it, but if there is one, how do you ensure that a bureaucracy, the clandestine service of the CIA, that needs a certain degree of secrecy, is accountable, especially when it's working in these ways that are kind of hard to pinpoint with foreigners, directing activities against individuals? I mean, you can see if an insurgency isn't working. You can see if a political party has been funded to win an election and didn't win it. You can't quite see what happened to that guy, like Belhaj, the Libyan fighter who's now a key military force in Tripoli. What happened to him in his rendition? So I think that, I think there are two separate issues, and I agree with you that in both cases the policy is wanting.
We call on Robert Baum, one of our fellows and an Africanist. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Thanks.
He's got the microphone.
Hi. I'm Elizabeth Schmidt. I teach African history at Loyola University in Maryland. And what was just said about the conservative Republicans who had their links to Wall Street and investments, and Katanga was obviously very, very rich in minerals, uranium, including the uranium that was used for the first atom bombs. But I'm wondering if you could talk perhaps a little bit more about the Katanga lobby in Congress, which was very similar to the Rhodesia lobby that emerged later. It had a lot of links to the sort of pro-segregationist democratic South. So, thank you.
Right. Well, briefly on that, I actually once met the Katanga lobbyist who gave me his files. And a guy named Marvin Liebman, who is associated with the National Review, conservative type things, was a publicist, and there were Belgian mining interests and the government of Katanga that had hired people, and they worked with Senator Dodd in particular.
This is the senior Dodd, of course.
Father of Chris Dodd, Thomas Dodd, and he became a fanatical believer in Chambé, and delayed the eventual decision of the United Nations to finally do what Lumumba wanted them to do. They did it, but they did it a year and a half too late. And they did it in 1962. This was, though, after the Afro-Asian majority in the UN had forced stronger resolutions through, partly as a result of Lumumba's death, and U.S. policy was shifting as well. So there was an effective lobby. I think that what happened with Douglas Dillon and people like that, though, I tried very hard to see were there particular economic interests, and of course his firm had a little bit of interest there. But I, in the end, felt it was basically the overall kind of ideological perspective of conservatives as opposed to liberals, maybe, who were very suspicious of Lumumba because he just wasn't conservative enough. It wasn't that there was a particular economic interest that they were trying to protect. Whereas in the case of the Katanga lobby, I think there were particular economic interests that were helping fund that lobby.
Robert Baum?
Robert Baum from the Wilson Center. Appreciated your talk very much. I couldn't help but think about something as an historian as I listened to you. There's a tension you mentioned, and I agree with you, between human rights and international security issues or national security issues. There's another tension, I think, that in colonial history or imperial history, we call the tension between the metropole and the man on the spot. That there's in many of in the period of colonization and European expansion, there were often local administrators who went way beyond the policies established in London or Paris, particularly when they were concerned about saving money and things of that sort. And much of the colonization by the British in particular was done by local people exceeding their authority. And this, I think, also applies to the French. I'm wondering to what extent Devlin was exceeding his authority, that he was the man on the spot who knew a great deal about the local situation but had a less complete view of the broader picture that might have been available in Langley. And how can the CIA try to manage that local expertise and harness it to a more global policy?
Of course, with Larry Devlin, you had a situation where he did have expertise, but he didn't know anything about the Congo before he got there, as he acknowledges in his book. So he was recruiting Soviet at the time, agents in Belgium for 3 years before he went there, and probably absorbed a little bit of the Belgian perspective. My position on this is that you need to do two things if you really want to assure accountability. One is there has to be a reorientation of the bureaucracy through training, through career performance incentives and so forth, to incorporate some concern for these other matters. I mean, we kind of acknowledge this when we have training programs abroad. We're training military people to think about human rights and so forth. But it's not just training. It's that the bureaucracy will reward people who are conforming to this and punish people who won't. It's got to be a reorientation. The second thing is, and former CIA Legislative Council agree with this, others, you've got to have really effective independent oversight. A good example of it, even though the report is wanting in many respects, is that Peruvian study by the Office of Inspector General. It isn't perfect, but he really got into it. And he watched all the videotapes. They interviewed all the people in the Peruvian Air Force and the American. They got on top of it. And if we ever know the full report he did on detentions and interrogations from 2001 to 2003, American detentions and interrogations, we might find that he got on top of that too, because he visited the so-called black sites and everything. So maybe building on the semi-independent Inspector General. We've had congressional oversight, but unfortunately, I mean, you have to have a large staff commitment, it seems to me, and a large political commitment to do that. And we've had neither on the part of Congress except sporadically. Now, obviously, you have to have a political commitment somewhere, or any mechanism that you install is not going to work. But I think that developing that political commitment and focusing in that direction is an important way to go, especially now that these things are, this isn't just peripheral to our foreign policy, this is a major theme of our foreign policy. And in the past, it's caused some major embarrassments to the United States foreign policy.
Ross Johnson.
Ross Johnson, Wilson Center. Specific question and then a more general issue, I suppose. The specific question has to do with Devlin in the Congo. And I mean, I dimly remember his memoir, where I think at one point he's refusing instructions to what? To poison, to kill directly.
That's what his line was.
Yeah.
Which I don't accept.
And what I don't remember is, I mean, you make the point that he had foreknowledge, but he didn't report it. And I'm just curious, did you have that discussion with him, and what does he say about that?
I did. In fact, I had it with him twice, once at a Wilson Center conference. But the first time I had it on the phone, I published an article in the Washington Post on this stuff in 2002, and I spoke to him. He was actually in Paris. I spoke to him on the phone, and he was writing his memoir for his grandchildren. And he just, I don't remember that cable. You know, as most CIA people who I interview, they never read the Church Committee report. And, you know, he didn't remember the cable. I told him about it, and he still, I don't remember being warned in advance. And he said the same thing in his memoir. And he did not say anything to the Church Committee. The Church Committee had 2 hearings with him. At no point, now Church Committee, and this is one of the reasons for their failure, the Church Committee didn't have the cable until after he'd finished his hearings and gone back to the Congo, because he was now working for a private firm there. They tried to call him back, but then he said he had a heart problem. But they only got that cable afterwards. So, but he didn't volunteer in any of the discussions they had with him that he had foreknowledge. And again, I don't think he could admit it, because it became very, especially if he was going to be questioned about it, because that would unleash the whole problem of, well, if you had foreknowledge, what did you think they were going to do to him? Did you tell the ambassador? Did you send a report? What about this?
Well, giving truthful presentation, of course, is not necessarily giving full truthful,
right.
Which I think is...
Can I raise my general issue?
Oh, quickly.
Do I have a second? Quickly, but I mean, it's a huge issue. Accountability, it seems to me, begs as many issues as it may pose. You want someone to be accountable for a gentle rendition. I mean, isn't the problem posing sort of the task in the first place? We're going to send somebody to where? To Syria to be interrogated. Why in the world? Because things will happen there that we wouldn't want to happen here. I mean, these are incompatible desiderata, aren't they? It's sort of like, you know, police informers. Yeah, we got to have a lot of police informers, but we only want to deal with good people, right? None of those bad people. So it doesn't just go beyond accountability, really, to how we think about sort of national objectives and, you know, what we're willing to sacrifice, if you want to use that word, for certain objectives. It seems to me this goes far beyond accountability.
I agree, and my argument has been that the lack of accountability prevents that discussion. It prevents that consideration of where do you draw the balance. And if we don't get out there and acknowledge that there is a problem and simply let the agency that is always going to weigh a little more on one side of the balance than the other make the decision, then we are postponing that national consideration. And there'll be and then when somebody gets out of rendition, like has happened, and then they tell the story, then there's a big embarrassment and a reaction, and you know the policy may change. That's a kind of a helter-skelter way of looking at this thing. So I agree with you completely that it isn't. The accountability is a task, is an instrument for our democracy making good policies, or policies that are appropriate.
John Prados.
John Prados, National Security Archive. Stephen, I don't disagree with any of this commentary, but I want to raise the larger issue of the Congo. You started out by saying that, you know, the Lumumba incident had such a great importance, and it did. It catalyzed many things that happened, but this process of intervention went on over several years, starting from 1960, and the United States became progressively more heavily involved to the degree that we were manipulating the United Nations, and we were backstopping the Secretary General on both sides, and we were doing all these various things inside the Congo, and then we were pushing the United Nations forces in the Congo, ultimately to overthrow Katanga themselves. So here's my question. Balance these two things for us, you know. If you had to judge the relative importance of Lumumba versus the importance of all those things that were consequent to it.
Right. I tried, you know, to say I'm not hanging everything on the Lumumba death. But obviously, it's sort of like, you know, you say, well, you put in Mossadegh in Iran, and then later, you know, you have Ayatollah Khomeini and overthrowing the Shah, and it's all because you overthrew him, Mossadegh in Iran. Later you get the Shah overthrown because you overthrew Mossadegh in Iran. Everybody blames you for that. Well, obviously, that's not the only thing. It's all the successive steps that occur after this, between 1953 in Iran and 1979, where you're, you know, sort of going along with the Shah's kind of military orientation, repression, and so forth. And so, but I think the Lumumba death, the reason it was so important for the history of the Congo was it really teed off this violence that was so intense in the rebellions that occurred against the Mobutu-led government, the use of mercenaries that then ensued. U.S. was willing to pay for them, didn't have to, but certainly brought in white mercenaries who would just come in and shoot everybody in rebel-held areas. Today, it would be genocide, people would be saying. This had such an important effect over a period of time. So throughout the period of strong CIA support of Mobutu et al., 1960 to 69, that I think it helped form the political tradition of the independent Congo. And a lot of the inability, it sort of created the basis for Mobutu tyranny that eventually developed. And I think it also created a feeling among Congolese that I met that, we can't do anything. We're dependent on the West. Congolese used to, when I worked for Congress, come and plead, we should overthrow Mobutu, not them. And so I think it had a long-standing effect on the tradition of the Congo. Now, I would agree with you, though, to the extent if you suggest that, well, maybe the United States could have changed its policy and prevented, some of the worst things later on, and maybe the Congo would have looked a little different if we had allowed Mobutu, for example, to be overthrown in 1977 and 78, when he was challenged by various forces, or if we had facilitated a transfer to democracy in 1992 and 1993, which we failed to do under the Clinton administration. So I agree there's a whole chain of steps. I don't want to put it all on that. Is that answering?
Someone right here.
Steve, thank you for your presentation. Fariborz Fatemi from Oxford Chart Group. You've written a lot about accountability and other articles and other things. And my interest is, when these two key reports on Iran and the Congo has taken so long to be released, what does it say to people who are supposed to be held accountable? I think they laugh at it. I mean, how do you keep people accountable when these two reports, much of it, I should say, on Iran and Congo has been out already?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. I think, you have to, certainly if the Congo report had come out in 2000, I think some of what I'm saying, I would expect, might have been in there. Because maybe it would have been, if there had been a good declassification process, and we don't know, we'll have to see what the results are. Maybe by then Hillary Clinton, when she went to the Congo, would have done what President Obama almost did with Iran and issued an apology. Or President Clinton, if it was earlier. But certainly that is the kind of thing that might have happened. So I think I guess I've been looking at this in a kind of a scholarly context. I'm saying, look, how can we deal with these issues when we can't even look back 50 years? We can't even look back. We're dealing with the Congo today, and we don't know still the full nature of the CIA operations in the Congo from the 60s. And we may not know even when the volume is published, because they may eliminate the names of the people who got the money. So how do we deal with the past? Look, all the people in the Congo except one, who were the main leaders, are dead. Larry Devlin is dead. Some stuff is on the public record from the Church Committee. What excuse is there for not putting it all out there? There is no excuse. And yet, that's how this important part of American diplomatic history, and it's not only the Congo, it's so many other countries, is being dealt with. One last example, you have the 5 studies I mentioned of paramilitary action that are referred to in the final report of the Church Committee, but have never been released. 5 studies of paramilitary action at a time when right now paramilitary action is very important to the CIA. And these studies have never been released. So we can't benefit from them. And it just seems to me, and these are all way back when studies.
We have time for one more question. If not, Roger will close with any remarks he might have, and then after that, join us for a reception. We do have one more question. Sorry. Wait for the microphone.
I'll try to give a quick answer.
All right.
Michael Pillsbury, Defense Department, former conservative Republican staffer, working with Steve to some degree. I'd like to ask Steve if he's seen two books and what he thinks about them. One is by Madeleine Kolb, called The Congo Cables, in which, according to her, CIA declassified for the first time operational station cables about all these events. You have not mentioned her today. I don't understand if you if you do it in your forthcoming book or don't think it's important.
Don't have a forthcoming book on this, so I can't do it there.
But it's pretty interesting if CIA declassifies operational station cables. Second question is, have you seen a new book by a pseudonym, Ishmael Jones, called The Human Factor? He's a CIA case officer for 15 years who has resigned and gone up to brief Dianne Feinstein and the House side and so forth on the issue that there's too much accountability. And he gives example after example in 300 pages of how he and his colleagues were handicapped, lost opportunities, failed again and again and again because of accountability issues. He often had to fly home to CIA headquarters, dig out requests he'd made to see a specific individual just for an initial conversation. Find it in the inbox of one of many, many accountability people, dig it out, and even sign it himself or get someone else to sign it before he could make a lunch date with a foreign source. Most of his time is in the Middle East. The CIA did not approve his book for publication. In fact, they said, you cannot publish this book. And he published it anyway under a pseudonym. So have you seen his book? It's called The Human Factor, because it's really the other side of the story or of your position, that there's way too much accountability now.
Well, I'll definitely look for the book. I think I saw it browsing in a bookstore. The bookstores are disappearing. It's hard to browse anymore. But I definitely will read the book and see his perspective. On the CALB thing, though, no operational cables that I'm aware of were declassified. Her resource was State Department cables, and she also cited some of the Church Committee cables. The cables that I've been able to look at were the ones that were in the Church Committee boxes that they had collected for their investigation but never published, and gradually have been reviewed under some special track. So some of that has become visible. But Madeleine Kolb's book didn't really include those. But I will look for the book you mentioned.
Roger, any final words?
Just the final word is that we hope that everyone will continue the conversation over a glass of wine. Thank you, Steve.